The association between comics and other media, I think, is probably deeply rooted in the birth and long-term history of comics. But you can definitely see the 60s and the Barbarella effect, exactly as you've just said, producing many, many different formats and reproductions. And I guess the difference between now and then is that at the time that was happening in extremely fast and almost uncontrolled media landscape of self-production, plagiarism, pastiche, remaking of products in one part of the world without the other part of the world knowing. So for example, I've researched the translation of Barbarella from French to English, and that was a hugely confused process of telegrams and documents going missing and debates about republishing book 2 or not. The media landscape today and the role of comics is completely different, probably much more systematically organised through large corporate film studios. And issues of copyright. One of the interesting things of pop art is its appropriative tendencies. And the interesting thing from my reading of Roy Lichtenstein's biography, that the only person to have ever taken a legal case against Lichtenstein was a artist illustrator from an art history book, not a comics artist. Whereas today, apart from the corporate landscape, the legal copyright landscape would be interesting.
It's too difficult a question for me. I think Hugo is, let's say, has more to say on that than I could do. The first thing to do would be to, I think you should, let's say, make distinctions on the different types and subfields of comics. Clearly, the relationship between, let's say, the superhero field in comics and media adaptations is much stronger than I'd say the mutual enrichment of these fields is much stronger than in the case of, for instance, Tintin, which has been heavily cross-medialized from there were already theater adaptations in the 40s. You had slideshow adaptations in the 50s. Do you remember Viewmaster? You had Viewmaster versions of Tintin. You had movies, but that, let's say, faded away after the 1960s for different reasons. The publisher had also created, the publisher of the Tintin magazine had created a company on, let's say, on the making of animated film adaptations, which can still be seen on television. But apparently, for the audience, both the general audience and the more, let's say, scholarly specialized audience, there was a kind of qualitative mismatch between the original work and the adaptations. In the case of Tintin and comparable work, while in the superhero field, well, you really see, even if you don't like the movies, they really bring something into that world, and vice versa. That, let's say, cross-fertilization was less stronger in, let's say, in continental Europe. And I don't mention Asterix and things like that. It's less massive and less successful in the case of, let's say, the more ambitious comics and graphic novel production. So and Hugo already said that very clearly, if, let's say, the continental production is so thriving, if it's so influential today, it's mainly due to the fact that, and here my heart is bleeding, that, well, I like it very much, of course, that production is so prominent in contemporary modern and cultural life, but it's, let's say, pushing aside literature. For instance, there is a famous or infamous comics Proust adaptation in France, okay, which Proust readers, Proust lovers, and also, let's say, lovers of contemporary graphic novel were ready to commit suicide when, not when that series appeared, but when it appeared that it was extremely successful. Of course, everybody was very jealous as well, but that's another question. And the marketing policy was very clear, namely, nobody has the time to read the 3,000 pages of In Search of Lost Time, and here you have the graphic novel, which will help you to read it in, let's say, 2-3 evenings. By the way, it was exactly the same argument that was used by Will Eisner in his preface to A Contract with God, where he said, literature is important, we need to read, but we don't have time to read any longer, and this will be the literature of the future. But this is my point of view. For me, there is no incompatibility between both. There should be a cross-fertilization, but in practice, yes, you see that there is, let's say, a tendency to replace certain literary reading by graphic novel reading, hence the incredible hype of literary adaptations in graphic novel, which is quite a recent phenomenon. Since when the graphic novel, let's say, in the 60s, 70s emerged, and then when it's institutionalized in the 80s and the 90s, there were very few literary adaptations. Since there was the anti-model of the classics illustrated, everybody wanted to stay away from that. And there was also the idea that a literary adaptation in a graphic novel would harm, let's say, the appreciation of the visual contribution. And in the context, all these graphic novels were auteur comics, so the authors wanted to be taken seriously, not just as writers, but also as visual artists. Today that has changed as well. It's clearly, as Hugo said, clearly positioned as literary works. When you read, let's say, for instance, articles on Fun Home, it's about everything except the visual dimension of Fun Home, which is understandable in the larger context of that move from literary reading to graphic novel reading. And in the, let's say, in the 70s and 80s, in the word graphic novel, the emphasis was on graphic, and today it's on novel. And I'm not always very happy with that, let's say, that move. But this is a very personal opinion as well. You certainly don't have to agree.